This is the Person of Interest podcast, where we meet extraordinary people with a story to tell.
Well, welcome back to the Stockholm School of Economics in Riga for our first podcast of 2020 and launching the new decade. I'm delighted to have a really excellent guest who's got a wealth of expertise in various areas that she's going to share with us. It's Baiba Rubesa. Welcome, Baiba.
Thank you very much for the welcome in the building. That I have the great responsibility, also a co-responsibility with others, to be part of the supervisory board of the foundation.
Well, that's
for Stockholm School.
Quite a good starting point, because what exactly does a supervisory board do? Because often within corporate structures there is, the executive board, supervisory board. It's called by different names sometimes, but what exactly do you do?
Well, first of all, the foundation itself is responsible really for the financial stability and sustainability of the school. And in many ways, in all ways, is independent also of the Stockholm School of Economics in Stockholm, in Sweden. So the essence of the foundation is the viability of the school, and therefore also the quality and its development. The supervisory board is responsible for making sure that this happens, that the school doesn't go under, and that it develops positively. And in terms of a supervisory function means precisely that the so-called management board, which in this case is actually the faculty under Spalslo, is functioning properly, that we have the right amount of students applying at the right price, how this is all financed, and how we can evolve in cooperation with other schools, potentially within the Stockholm School of Economics family, let's call it that.
But in terms of nuts and bolts, and I don't mean specifically even with SSE, supervisory board, but is it the case that people sort of bring information to you for review, or you have a sort of detective function in that it's up to you to kind of keep an eye on things and then make recommendations, and then if you do flag something up, what sort of power do you have to enforce that? Is it just recommendations that you make?
Well, supervisory boards do not only make recommendations. At the end of the day, they really are responsible for very specific facets. And it doesn't matter whether this is an NGO or a large corporation. That's sort of first and foremost. Secondly, yes, we get information prepared for us. Some that is very regular reporting, which would be as in any entity based on financials, or maybe other aspects. For sure, also on, let's say, the management, the individuals that are involved in management, as well as in execution. In this case, you're looking at the faculty and the quality of the faculty of the Stockholm School of Economics in Riga. And most of the time, there's a set agenda over a year or 2 years, but certainly over a year.
You'll be meeting sort of monthly or?
Yeah, well, at a minimum quarterly. It's a little bit more than that. And then there will be issues that will pop up that come from within the supervisory function. There are some people that are appointed by, let's say, the Swedish ministries, the relevant ministries. We have, of course, representatives from Latvian University. I represent the businesses that support the school, and then there are some individuals as well as a representative from the alumni. So it's a very interesting, I'd say, circle of interests represented there, and everybody with a slightly different angle of looking at the viability of the school.
And one question I have to ask you about it then is, what's the gender split on the supervisory board? Because we're going to be talking in a little bit about women in business and executive positions.
It is as in very many other places. I have the great responsibility of being the only woman on that board.
Okay, which is not an ideal situation.
No, but CFO...
You could supervise yourselves a little bit.
Yeah, well, such is life. We evolve over time.
Well, then, could you just give us a little bit of background for those that don't know on your career, how you got into the business world? What was it that attracted you to the business world in the first place?
Well, I'm a Canadian Latvian who grew up in Germany, and I worked in different spheres. I was actually attracted mainly to the world of communications, and still am actually. And with that went into different business areas. The other one was also, I was always attracted to politics, and actually my first job was in the office of the Premier of Ontario, which is a province that is significantly larger than the three Baltic states put together, population-wise or even budget-wise. At the time, which is a very long time ago from today.
But what was it that got you into politics then? Was it that feeling that you can make a difference? Or was it just sort of relishing the ideological battle, or what?
Mike, I have no idea. I really can't respond to that. I think that I grew up in an environment where politics was important. In this case, my parents and their friends feeling very mandated to work towards a free and independent Latvia, and was sort of inspired by that. And it went on to other things. I grew up in a time when I'm from Toronto, and Toronto had sort of a pivotal turn in the early 70s in a mayoral race that was between developers and the others that wanted a better community for Toronto. And there was an iconic politician was elected whose name was David Crombie, who was known as the tiny perfect mayor because he wasn't terribly tall, but he had a very perfect program. I would claim that on a high level, it is the same battle that will be fought in Riga somewhere in the next quarter. But politics, I think, is about being able to create a better environment for people. That has always attracted me, not necessarily only for nationalistic reasons or something like that, but how is it to live better and influence and move hearts and minds. So that's sort of the politics part. But from there, it went on from one to the other. A more interesting job was for the Volkswagen Group in Germany, in a communications department, going from racing to corporate image and sponsorships and all that kind of stuff. And in that time, or at that time, the Berlin Wall fell. In 1989, and of course the precursors to that were very many Latvians coming to visit. At that time in Western Germany, I lived in Braunschweig, and in the first, I think it was 1987 or thereabouts, I had 130 people stay with me that I had never met before, from Latvia. So the very natural development was ultimately to move here over 25 years ago. And from that point, I'm probably best known in Latvia, or in the Baltic for that matter, for having worked for Statoil, a company that today is known either as Equinor in the upstream business or Circle K in the downstream business, both in developing the Baltic service station network, marketing programs, and ultimately being the managing director of Statoil in Latvia. And then from there, moving on to doing government affairs in the Caucasus, living in Baku for that area, for the Equinor part, I would call it today, it's Statoil then, and then vice president for corporate social responsibility for the group out of Norway. And then came the first decision to quit. It was a wonderful 17 years in the company, and to be able to do work like that is quite encompassing in time and energy and what it demands of you, I'd say, of your private life. I think there are very few high-level jobs that don't demand investment in the way that you use time. And I came by virtue of my brother-in-law dying of cancer at a very young age, came to the decision that life was too short to be working all the time. And then made the decision to leave, came back to Latvia, worked a little bit of consulting on my own, as so many people do who are trying to figure out what to do with themselves. And then I became the CEO of RB Rail, which is the company that is mandated to implement Rail Baltica, which is the largest infrastructure project in this part of the world in over a century, and probably one of the key infrastructure projects for the European Union. And I left there just over a year ago, and now I'm in the process of reinventing myself again, which is a good one.
Well, you've mentioned the key word quit, which I've got written down on my pad here, which may be a note to myself, I'm not sure. But as you've mentioned this word, this is something that I really wanted to take up with you. The idea that when we're talking about business in particular, but lots of other spheres as well, everyone's talking about, follow your dream, never give up. But sometimes you do actually have to give up, or
Yes.
you feel that time has come to make a change, or you've gone stagnant, you've just been doing the same thing too long, the repetition of the daily grind becomes too much. But that can be a really terrifying thing, because it's always to some extent a leap into the unknown. So I wanted to kind of get your advice on how to quit. What is the right way to quit and the right time to quit? You mentioned that with the getting out of Statoil as it was then, this was very much a kind of an external factor, which I guess has caused, as you described it, kind of reevaluation
Sure.
of what's important in life. But the second time with RB Rail, it was quite different in that this was obviously a very intellectual decision you'd made, something that you'd considered in a very reasoned way. And I remember watching live your press conference in which you resigned, and it was quite interesting in that it was very controlled. There were obviously things that you wanted to say, there were things you knew you couldn't quite say but you could hint at, and there were things which were sort of off limits as well, because simply for legal purposes and
Yes.
so on as well. So I wanted to kind of ask, what was your thought process in setting that up, and could we maybe use that as a template for kind of quitting with dignity, or quitting while giving a message other than I'm off? Because often people will have this feeling that, this is the end of it for me, I don't really care what happens next. The way you did it, you made a point of saying you do care what happens next, and that's part of the reason why you're quitting.
Well, I think all human beings, when faced with change, have a little bit of trepidation. Everybody in any organization that have ever been faced with, we are going to change the organization, are usually faced with the immediate intuitive question of what's going to happen to me. And of course, leaving something behind more or less on your own volition is a very brave decision to make, especially when the going is good, even when the going is rocky, but still, pretty good. In the Statoil case, I thought about that for quite a long time before the opportunity presented itself that the leaving would be a win-win situation in quite a lot of ways. And I thought a lot about what I would do afterwards. I think the first thing that needs to be able to resign or leave something behind easily is for yourself to be free with the thought that you're going to do it. So you have to understand that it will happen, and when you actually decide to do that, you never know what will really happen afterwards. Most leaders and business managers, especially in very specific sort of areas, tend to think that they can plan, sort of strategies and futures, and they will all fall into place. Well, my experience is that is not the case. You can have a pretty good scenario of the options of what may happen, but you never know what will happen afterwards. So number one is be comfortable with the decision that you're making, that you're leaving, the decision that you're leaving yourself, number one. Number two, I think what is also to understand why you're going. Is this the right thing to do? Before I left RB Rail, I talked about it to a lot of people. And as a matter of fact, when I left Latvia Statoil to go to Baku, I told a lot of people in advance that I'm thinking of going. I was looking for where to go, and I made sure that there were people who can follow in my footsteps, as it were, that there were several candidates to choose from to thereafter become the CEO. And in some ways, this is also the case in RB Rail, but then they have shareholders that are completely unpredictable. So this is, there's no normal planning behind any of that as well. In the case in the other one is once you make the decision, it is why are you leaving? And I think you're very right in pointing out that I really cared what would happen afterwards. I think that even the overpaid executives in the United States actually care when they leave, because you invest a lot of time in a business, usually in the people and service or product development or whatever. I was very determined that I would leave at the right time, and timing in many ways is everything. It is no secret, especially those that will look it up afterwards on the internet, is that there was an attempt to get rid of me quite a long time before I resigned. But this was the case almost from the first month of taking over the position. So it was a 3-year-long, how do we get rid of her story in different strengths over time. I knew that, a project like Rail Baltica, where 5 countries and the European Union involved, is the quintessence of complexity. And therefore, there are many things that you discover because there's no other project of its kind, I would say, in the world today, because of the political complexity of it. Because building tracks is kind of simple, relatively speaking, but everything else is very, very complex. And there was no doubt in my mind and in my team's mind that there were a lot of holes kind of to be fixed, first and foremost in the European Union. And therefore, one of the reasons that I did what I did was to really prepare a document to share upon leaving. And it was, I can't remember, I think 14 pages or something, with argumented suggestions for projects of this kind, what needs to be improved for them to work better anywhere in the world, or at a minimum in the European Union. So that was number one. I must say I also prepared a case to possibly take some actors to court and sue them for overstepping or ignoring their responsibilities in terms of the shareholders agreement for RB Rail. But I think I was well advised not to do so because the Latvian system, first of all, legal system, is much too slow. And I would have to be privately suing all of them, for the next 10 years. And for that, I decided life is too short.
But that's interesting that suggests to me that maybe there was some anger behind your decision.
Oh, no question.
As well.
Of course.
But then not showing that anger, or maybe only showing enough of it to serve the purpose you wanted to, or the point you wanted to make with the resignation. It must be quite difficult to rein in. So I'm just interested in what was the thought process kind of immediately before you held your press conference or you announced your resignation. Is it a case of, look, take a deep breath, whatever anyone says, I must stay calm? Or was it, look, I'm just going to be completely open and whatever anyone asks me, I'm going to try and answer, honestly, almost regardless of the consequences?
I had intended to resign over a month earlier, initially, and for different pragmatic reasons didn't do so. So I was well prepared. I took a tablet or two beforehand. And I had somebody give me a wee drink of cognac beforehand.
Okay.
So,
we're not recommending this. We are.
Not necessarily. I'm
this.
just. I think it depends on the individuals.
Yeah.
I am certainly more emotional than your average business person. My staff have often seen me crying in different places, and that was what I was most worried about. That I will just break out in tears. But I think if you are going to take such steps, especially publicly, is talk through the text. I knew what I was going to say. I had a text in front of me, but boy, I had already read it many times out loud beforehand, so that you actually know which are the bumps in the road when you're going, which are the triggers that will make you more emotional or not.
But do you think if you had been more emotional, that would have been perceived as weakness, perhaps?
Of course, especially by a woman.
Yeah.
You know, I've seen lots of men behave very emotionally, and it's not seen as emotional. You know, it's just angry or forceful or whatever.
Or them showing their human side. It will often be,
For example,
you know,
yeah. But for women, and I think women that are strident, I think I had every right to be angry. I am still angry at the owners that are involved because they are letting a fabulous project down to this day, to this moment in the interview. And I think it will be a great opportunity lost. That's all that I can say. That part angers me deeply. And I think it's okay to channel the anger into something constructive. I think destructive activities are not good under any circumstances. I mean, I've come from the fuel business. And the fuel business in Latvia, when I was involved in it, was a highly gray economy, which has decreased over the years. And the young'uns of today have no idea, what kind of a crazy environment there was here around selling gasoline and diesel, 20 years ago or 15 years ago. And I've sat with many a bandit at one table. And he knew that I knew that he knew that I knew, that they're bandits, basically. But somehow you have to find the constructive way forward to eliminate the work that these bandits do.
But presumably you also have to signal to the bandits that, as well as
Sure.
you know and they know, that you're not someone to be trifled with, or they're not
Sure.
going to take you for a ride.
Yes.
And I imagine as a woman, that's even harder perhaps, because you can't, well, you can, but it may be difficult to act like a bandit yourself.
Mike, I don't know. I have a hard time with the within myself with this, women in business as to opposed to men. So it's kind of pygmies versus giants in business. Hello, I think that individuals are rather different. Women have a harder time because everybody looks at them in terms of being in an unusual position. I've spoken to women that have worked in very male categories in World War II when the boys were off fighting, and the women had to take over the responsibilities of males. And what happens when the boys come home? So it's a very, difficult topic to deal with. But nobody wants to hear bad news from a woman. Nobody. You get labeled. I know that you get all kinds of terrible labels. But, at the end of the day, I think you can kill them with kindness and say, this is my position, this is your position. And I think the most important part when you're dealing with very difficult situations is building coalitions. I've just finished watching the last 2 seasons of Madam Secretary that I loved very much, and in the part where she's still the Secretary of State, it is telling to see in how many situations there is a genuine conflict, and they say, well, let's first build a coalition. And I think in the jobs where it was where there were very challenging, tough questions, where you do not want to be the only one in the mark of your opposition, it is important to build coalitions, which actually happens.
Well, just coming back to the quitting thing,
Yes.
though.
Yeah.
I kind of got you to describe how you felt immediately before the seminal press conference,
Yes.
let's call it. How did you feel immediately afterwards?
Extremely relieved.
Yeah.
In general, I think the decision to quit or resign is a hard one. Then the next hard one is to tell somebody that you're actually doing it, especially the ones that want least for you to leave. And then the next one is, again, building the coalition and the support to be able to resign smartly. And I think each situation, I'm sure, is quite different. Many politicians will tell you that, how they come to these decisions, especially when you think you can or cannot have an effect on with your resignation. But no, the feeling was a very high relief, no question about it.
And how important is it to you, maybe in a more general sense, to resign rather than be sacked?
Well, I've never had the phenomena of really being sacked, so I don't know what that really is like. I know there have been where we've split ways where you kind of go, this isn't going to work. But I think it was important. I could have just as well just let the contract, end of story. But I felt and still feel that this was a very badly managed project on behalf of the shareholders and of the three countries. And I think still things hopefully can still be saved and turned to a better position. I am very much into constructive solutions to anything.
But then maybe a slightly related note, clearly related note. You've been a managing director of a major company. Presumably you have had to dismiss people yourself.
Yes.
Could you compare sort of these two feelings of getting rid of yourself and getting rid of other people? Because in a way, that's kind of, worse, isn't it? I mean, at least you can take responsibility for yourself, but if you're...
Of course it's worse.
It's, gross negligence or something, it's quite hard to sack people.
Any of these processes for yourself or having to let anybody else go is hard. It is a humanly hard thing to do. Both of them need preparation. And for both of them, you need to find the right words. Actually, New Year's, just right after New Year's, I went in a group of former colleagues, one of which I had fired a long time ago from a specific job, and who told me a few years later, he says, Baiba, thank you very much for firing me the way that you did, because it's actually shown me the way to go further. Usually, as you say, unless it's something like gross negligence or stealing or whatever else, it's just that you're not fitting the situation. It's not the right person in the right place at the right time. And therefore, if you cannot solve this conundrum in a pragmatic way for the task at hand, it's usually also the person that you're firing knows that it's the right thing to do in their heart of hearts.
And have there been any regrets not just with the
resignation,
but I mean, in the wider sort of your business life, there must have been like opportunities you felt slip by, which maybe if you had a chance again, you would have seized. Anything like that?
Lord, hindsight is, ever so smart and ever so foolish as well. I do not regret the RB Rail 3 years. They were extraordinary in very many ways. I think it's unfortunate that very few institutions or individuals want to even find out what can be taken away from it. I think there's a strong ignorance around it. And I would even say if I were male, I'd probably be more approachable than by being female in this sort of a situation. But what would have happened if something would have happened, Lord only knows. I have no idea. So now I think is the time to figure out what to do next, which I am certainly in the process of doing. And we'll see where it goes from there.
Well, you mentioned at the beginning of our talk that you started off in politics, and in the European elections last year, you were a candidate again. So is that something that you feel you've sort of gone full circle and now it's time to sort of start the cycle?
Well, I've never been a candidate before. That was the only time I've been a candidate for the European Parliament, and I think I would have been damn good at it, precisely because of the experience that I have. I do not, at least at this point in time, to the best of my knowledge, there is nothing that interests me to be a candidate for. But I am certainly still part of a member of the Liberal Party, PAR, I don't intend to leave the party, at least not in the foreseeable future, though one never knows, but not really. And I think it is still worthwhile trying to develop things in a political environment that is good for any European citizen, not just Latvia, but Europeans.
And how did it feel to be under political scrutiny? When you're a candidate, you have all sorts of people rooting through your character, asking you questions. You have to be available, and you have to answer their questions, really. How did that compare to the sort of scrutiny you're talking about on the business side, on supervisory boards, and so on? Is one technical and one is sort of more of a free-for-all, or is it basically the same thing?
I didn't find it very different. Having said that, I had a lot of very nasty media also, put on my tail in the Rail Baltica era. So, if anybody wants to see what can be found out about me, just, take a look. So that part was not, the scrutiny part doesn't impact me that much. What I found daunting is that you wind up in a gazillion meetings saying exactly the same thing. And the phenomena of having to try to stay on message is hard. That's all that I can say. And when I look at today, with today's tiny, Latvia is not a massive environment for an election campaign for the European Union. Latvia managed to just about elect almost all of the former deputies, bar 3. It's ironic at best. So from that point of view, I think the election campaign was fairly easy. The repetitiveness, in a way, is surprising, actually, because you have to stay on message. And in business, in a way, you do as well, but not nearly in the same way.
Well, in my little notebook, I've written staying on message, because I think that would be a very good topic for maybe a future discussion as well. So thank you for making that suggestion, and thank you very much for joining me today, Baiba.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you for listening. This podcast was produced by SSE Riga. If you'd like to learn more about the topic, visit the open course schedule at SSE Riga Executive Education. For more podcasts, find us on Spotify, iTunes, or the platform of your choice. Remember, share this episode with your friends and colleagues.